Here's another rear axle carrier panel repair for BMW E46 M3. This is a convertible model, 93,000 miles, SMG transmission and a late 2002 build. Standard hairline crack on the left rear mounting point of the rear axle carrier panel, plus a couple of spot welds on the very left of the panel. Nothing massively obvious on the right front at the moment until we take the axle out. The rear internal cavities inside the boot are good. No spot weld damages found when bore scope checking those, but we have got some internal cracks above the front mounts which are underneath the rear seat, and being a convertible it's got a bulkhead, convertible bulkhead to also tend with when we're going inside there. So next up is full strip down and then we can start assessing the panel more clearly. The rear axle is fully stripped and so is the wheel arches with the fuel tank system and fuel filler neck all taken apart, and carbon canisters removed. So this is how much we take out of the cars. We've got the rear seats out as well and the boot carpet trimmed. And now next up will be degreasing, because we need to see the car in its sort of barest state so we can check out all the mounting points of the rear axle carrier panel, see how many cracks and spot welds there are. We know we got a crack here next to the left rear mounting point. We need to carefully check things like all the other common hot spots, like the left of the side lip, check whether that's a spot weld broken in the middle of the chassis leg. We need to check the very top sections of the rear axle carrier panel, as well as closely for the front mount. So we're likely to have a semicircle sort of crack around the hex of where this stud would have been, which is roughly about there, but we need to check if there's a crack coming out of that spot weld and whether these are just flecks or whether they got cracks as well. So degreasing next. So most of the degreasing is now done on this rear axle carrier panel and into the arches. Pretty good, pretty clean. Not a great amount of corrosion on it, which is always nice to see. Little hairline cracks on the front left mounting point just around that stud. And then we've also got a hairline crack on the right hand side mounting point, possibly a few spot welds that are either flexing or broken. At the moment the right rear looks okay. We might have a little spot weld starting to break up there, and a few studs are very poor, so they're going to need taking off and re-weld or putting some new studs on. And at the left rear we got the hairline crack which was noticed from underneath the car when it was all built up, that one there. A couple of spot welds that are showing movement. Also a couple of spot welds on the side of the panel that are showing breakages, which is confirmed with a crack in the seam sealer where the rear axle carrier panel is very slightly vibrating or moving away from the left wheel arch panel. We're also going to be taking care of some corrosion for the customer on these brackets, these 4 brackets, and also where the fuel tank has been rubbing just there on the chassis, because the rubber pads have probably been missing. That's also fuel tank contact. Battery tray bracket is pretty good, but we'll still probably be taking that one off, get rid of that, and also sort these studs out which are unusable because they've just got too much corrosion around them again now. Here's the cracked section, part of the rear axle carrier panel we've just taken out. Had a semicircle crack around the pin or the stud for the front bush, front left bush this is, where it rocks and rotates or twists torsionally. It breaks or cracks the little part of the rear axle carrier panel, so we then drill 8mm spot weld drills at the end of it to stop it, but also then make 2 straight line cuts, and that then allows a section of the panel to drop out, which is what we've got here holding in our hands. That gets rid of the cracked bit of metal, but it also creates us a channel to then get some good weld penetration into the threaded platform behind it. Now we've identified all the cracks and also the poor spot welds. We've managed to take out the section of cracked front pair of mounts around those front mounting points. Still got a bit of corrosion just to clean up, but drilled out the spot welds. Right rear doesn't seem to be any issues at the moment, and left rear is that common crack on the fold or pressed fold section of the standard area of the left rear mount. Seam sealer's come off on the left side lip with the wheel arch connection, ready for some spot weld replacing with plug welds. Here's the rear of the Redish V2 reinforcement plates. Now they've got weld through primer on there, which is just drying. And then if we look up at the chassis, we've just repaired the crack area. Remember there was a section we took out there that was cracked on the left front mounting point, and also the right front mounting point. That shadow is a little bit of the weld through primer, which is heavy and has come down the vertical face. So that's all cracks and spot welds repaired. Nothing on that right rear. and the left rear crack has been repaired, welded and flushed as smooth as we dare, because we need to put the reinforcement plate on. We're happy that those spot welds weren't broken, and we've done a little bit of corrosion treatment, so now there's no bare metal. We're ready to put the Redish V2 reinforcement plates on. Here's the sum of the items for the BMW M3 Rebuild. We've got a front air duct because that one's broken, and the fixings for it, and then these are mainly the rear axle items. It's not everything, we've still got more items to come in. A bonnet catch, front xenon potentiometer and drop link bracket, engine mounts, upper arm inner bushes, diff cover because the bushes are starting to separate, with the Loctite and all the bolts, and the oil bung top and bottom. Front diff bush with the bolt, we've got the updated bolts in the back of the diff cover. Trailing arm bushes, subframe bushes with the bolts and the nuts underneath. The exhaust clamp kit we'll be doing, which isn't in this picture, but there's the BMW crush gasket. Rear anti-roll bar drop links, upper arm inner bolts, power steering hose, lower camber arms with the inner bolts and the lock plates, and at the other end the eccentric camber adjustment bolts and the washers with the ball joints because they've got slight knocking on them. Power steering hose with the washers, prop CV joint gasket, prop coupling, constant pressure valve, and that is about it for the moment. Here's the rest of the parts for the Phoenix Yellow M3. We've got a genuine new V-brace, the fuel filter and the gearbox under trays, pollen filter housing cover, rear shock absorber, the additional dampers and all the top mount assembly, rear light side covers, rear light gaskets, left strut brace reinforcement, some various clips and fixings, steering tie rod gaiters, things like that, and fuel filler filling pot, which they call. The four main reinforcement plates are now welded on. That's the left front, the spacer plates in between to make the size correct for the position of the mounting of the rear axle. There's the right front, that's the right rear, and there's the left rear reinforcement plate. Now we're going to move on to the spot welds that are broken up in the left connection arch to the wheel arch. We've already done the stitch welding for the connection between the wheel arch panel and the rear axle carrier panel, and then later on we'll be moving on to the corrosion removal process. Here's some of the brackets we've removed from the chassis during the corrosion removal and treatment process. These two are on the battery box. They weren't too badly affected, a little bit of corrosion under one of them. Not too bad. These are the brake pipe brackets that were corroded, not loads again either, and these are the fuel tank strap brackets which are suffering, but they're certainly not the worst we've ever seen. But it's nice to attack this because all this is hidden area where you can't get to, so any of the paint would stick to the outside once it's cleaned up, but you'd struggle to stop that rust creeping around these edges. So in years to come you could start seeing corrosion again, which is why we like to attack and treat this corrosion. And then just looking at the chassis, show you where they live. These are the brake pipe area, and you can actually see it's not corrosion. That's an area where we couldn't get to because the bracket was in the way, but that's only dirt there. But the corrosion, interestingly, was directly between the metal layers, between the rear axle carrier panel and the brake pipe bracket. And a little bit here around the spot welds for this fuel tank strap bracket, and then a bit where the tank was rubbing. And then the other side, similar thing, just underneath the metal sheets where they possibly been moving, or where the electrophoretic coat when the car was dipped at the factory didn't get in between the panels. Here's some area where the fuel tank was rubbing just there, and then this is just general chassis flex that breaks the E-coat off. We'll be tackling that, and then just starting to remove the battery bracket here, which is the one which is for the non-M cars, which just purely serves as two studs just in here, or two nuts should I say, which just allows the fuel ventilation system to bolt up to, but not needed on the M3, so we'll take that off next. Here it is now. I've started loosening the connection points. We've just got one left, which will just tease off a little bit. Already you can see the corrosion that was hiding under there, which we didn't look too bad when the car first came in, and on the inside of that bracket. Here's the difference, just an example of the blasted ones that are on our exchange program. So these ones are now go away and be blasted for another car, and these ones are the ones that we've had blasted in a bulk section, and then they've got weld through primer on the back of them, and we're ready to get them welded on the car once we've attacked and treated the corrosion on the rear axle carrier panel. So we've removed the loose corrosion and now I'm treating the bare metal with POR 15 product called Metal Prep, which neutralises the corrosion, and that's got to stay moist for 30 minutes. So we're doing it over all the bare metal areas, and that will give it a zinc phosphate coat, which will be an excellent sort of base for the next layer, which is going to be etch primer. After a thorough wash down of the POR 15 Metal Prep chemical, we're now drying the underside of the chassis. We've done this for about an hour. It's not mandatory, I don't think, in their instructions, but we like to make sure that any of the low-lying brackets and any of the, well, just the parts of the rear axle carrier panel that could have had moisture in them, we want to make sure that they're bone dry. So that's what we're doing with this infrared drying lamp. And we're pretty much ready to go on to that next stage now. So we just look at the chassis, which has now had its corrosion treated, and any remaining sort of corrosion which is deep in the metal grain has been treated, neutralized with that chemical from POR 15. I think the worst area was over here where the fuel tank had been rubbing on this point up here. So you can see the metal grains affected. It's not smooth metal anymore like that, it's pitted with peaks and troughs, and these stitch welded areas where the rear axle carrier panel stitch welded as a seat panel were suffering with corrosion as well. But as you can see, we've gone through the E-coat, which is that green colour, to attack the corrosion wherever we find it, knock it all off and make it as loose as possible, get rid of it, and then treat the exposed or bare metal that was left over with the chemical to make sure it's stable, basically. So now we're just going to do quality control check-in, make sure that all the weld lines are finished and nothing else needs doing. Then we're going to put some weld through primer on these bracket areas up here. Now we've treated these corroded areas, and then we can weld those 4 brackets on, and that will almost complete the work underneath the car. Here's the brackets welded back on in place, brake pipe bracket and the fuel tank strap bracket, and we know now that there's no corrosion behind there because we've treated it. I've now put the etch primer on the bare metal areas and it's dried under the infrared lamps. So there's only a light dusting, it's just something on the bare metal where we've done our welding on the reinforcement plates, the spacer plates, and when we've done corrosion removal around the turrets on those brackets that we removed earlier on the battery tray where we took that nasty bracket off, up in the turrets for the rear shock absorbers, and then right rear plate, left rear plate, a little bit round the boot floor edge, and now I can move on to high build primer. So after the sprayable seam sealer, I top coated it with body colour, which was Phoenix yellow in this case, and it's been drying under the infrared lamps now. Plus we left it overnight, so this is fully cured, very nice and bright. Obviously we've got well, I've got good contrast actually, because that's factory paint just here, and this is our paint, and then our paint is all the way through the arches as well, right up to the arches. We cover the lips with a soft edge masking tape. We don't deal with that because that's painted, what we call finished paint, but we do paint onto any texture, any seam sealer. So these are the brackets that we took off and exchanged with our blasted ones. And then we've got, it looks a bit of a funny colour in this light, but it is Phoenix yellow. We've got lights in the workshop which I suppose aren't natural daylight, you'd say. There's factory paint there, and there's our Phoenix yellow here. So we're just going to start demasking and then check it out, make sure we're happy with it, and then we'll be doing cavity wax in all through the various cavity access holes to make sure that all the rear, the reinforcement plate area where we've been doing our welding is fully protected and there's never any bare metal. So we've now moved into the interior. We've got some MIG welds cracked which are underneath the cavity of the rear seat panel, which has exposed the top of the rear axle carrier panel MIG welds. So we're going to be cutting open a bit of the convertible bulkhead and then also the seat panel to access those, and we'll repair them and weld them and then cover it back over. So that's why the car is fully stripped and very well protected. So we're going to get cutting these areas open next. So we've made our access cut into the bulkhead, convertible bulkhead, which we'll put back later on and weld in place. And here's the seat panel. We've cut into the seat panel, and this is what we've come in for, this crack, which we noticed when we're doing our bore scope camera inspections. So it's only a tiny crack, hairline, but it is going through the MIG weld, and it can't be left, and very invasive process inside the car. doing all this just to get to that small crack, but it definitely needs to be done. So we'll clean this up and stop drill the ends of the crack, and then remove those affected MIG welds and re-weld them ourselves. So we've now stop drilled the ends of the cracks, removed the MIG welds, and exposed the threaded mount, which is the threaded receiver, we call that. And now everything's in a weld through primer, ready to weld. Here's the two new MIG welds that we've applied to secure the threaded receiver to the cavity panel cover. Now just masking up the edges and painting those black inside. Here's the cavity wax process. So we're inserted the ½ meter wand all the way through to the other reinforcement plate on the right rear. And now we're coating all the rear cavity sections where we've been carrying out our welding work. That's the cavity wax fully installed, which you can see all those brown droplets, which is like the amber colour that the cavity wax is. And we're going to let that finish dripping for probably half an hour or so, and then wipe off the excess. Here's some of the rear fixings we're replacing on the rear axle rebuild on this M3 Phoenix Yellow. So now the cavity wax is finished and all wiped off, just started putting the brake pipes back into position, all new brake pipe fitting, clips and chassis studs. Also the blue vent pipes gone on, the carbon canister and a couple of pipes have gone on, plus the bracket on the spare wheel section. All the grommets are back in position. Here's the new studs that we put on just now. Grommets are in, like I say. The studs that we've put in, we've waxed as well. So fuel tank's going in next. Fuel tank's now in, and so's the rear axle. We've done a bit of powder coating and replaced some new items on this, which we'll talk about later on in the video once it's finished, but I'll give you an idea. The rebuild is well underway and going nicely. So there's the finished result. We've welded back in the cover panel, which is the convertible bulkhead, with the welding all the way around the outside, plus the two little stitches that are in the factory locations. Then put a little bit of dusting of body colour paint after we primed it. So that's a bit of Phoenix yellow just to blend into the areas. And then we've also got our Redish 005 plate in the distance, which is on the seat panel and covers the cutout that we did to access the MIG welds earlier on. And there's a BMW grommet there, so you can take that out and also bore scope, camera check the MIG welds, make sure they're all okay in the future, or just top up cavity wax. But that is all the welding done inside the car now. Everything's back together now. The sub doors in, the aluminium covers are on, door cards are just going on, fuel tank, sound deadening pads on, and the emergency roof system tool is on. And you can just see the tops of the welds there, and that's where they are in relation to the back seat area. And these brake pipes were good enough to reuse, so the old ones are on there, and we've coated them with transparent wax and also a heavy coat of that at the union, so it's all sort of sealed over the union and the pipe, so no water will get in there, and they'll always come undone in the future. So the rebuild's complete on this E46 M3 Phoenix Yellow convertible. It's had a lot of work carried out, so we'll just talk through that, and we'll just go through the list of components that have been fitted. So we carried out the repair and reinforcement process to the rear axle carrier panel, which included the 4 mounting points, 2 at the rear, 2 at the front, and the spacer plates to level up the rear axle again. Then it's also had the front internal mounts repaired, which is what you saw on the video earlier on, going into the cavity underneath the rear seat panel and the convertible bulkhead to sort out the cracks in those MIG welds. Also some corrosion taken care of. There was corrosion on these brackets up here, which were taken off, blasted and re-welded back on. Also we took the battery tray corroded bracket off that was here, used to sit here, and there was also some corrosion on the rear turrets or the rear top mount area as well. So we took care of that on both sides of the car. Those are priced additionally, but there's things that people like to have done because we paint so much of the car. We paint literally the back half of the car all the way to the rear panel and up underneath the fuel tank area, and if some people want, then we'll do extended paint out into the wheel arches as well. So painting on top of corrosion is never a sensible thing, so that was all taken care of during these works as well. We've done extensive cavity waxing throughout the chassis of the car. Then we've also done powder coating of the subframe itself, which is the diff carrier, this main central piece. We've also cavity waxed in there, so that gets a blasted and powder coated rear subframe because that was suffering with corrosion. Rear camber arms also have been renewed with the genuine BMW camber adjustment system, the eccentric washers, nuts and the bolts on both sides so that the wheel alignment could be achieved correctly because the old ones were seized together. Also needed lower ball joints because this one was knocking very slightly and this one was knocking even less, but they were just noticeable, so new ball joints as well. Rear trailing iron bushes were also soft, so they've been replaced for Powerflex branded polyurethane items. Various fixings were covered with corrosion or struggling to remove, so we've renewed as many fixings as we can, whether it be grommets, top hats, self-tapping nuts, copper, exhaust washers, subframe bolts, shock bolts, as much as we could, V-brace bolts, things like that, like you saw in the video earlier on, bolts for the top and bottom arms. Then we've done the rear anti-roll bar drop links because bushes were starting to crack, so both sides have been replaced there. Rear top mounts were separating, so they've been renewed for the specific convertible ones, and also the shock absorbers were original units, whereas the fronts were already be replaced by somebody else maybe a year or two ago because they look quite fresh. So we put genuine BMW shock absorbers on there with the foam dampers and the bolts at the bottom and the protection tubes as well. The rear springs didn't match because the springs have got eye-back on the front and standard on the rear, so we've managed to find some used good condition eye-back springs, so the car's now got eye-back springs all around. Rear exhaust silencer clamps were broken, so we've put the X8R automotive clamp kit on there. Rear differential bushes were starting to separate on the back, and this one up here had oil contamination, so new rear diff bushes, and you can only get those with buying the cover, and then we also then buy the correct Loctite sealant, the updated bolts and washers, plus the 8 case bolts, and then we also match that with a genuine new diff bush for the front right as well, along with the M14 bolt which goes in there. So that's all diff bushes renewed. V-brace was quite corroded, so a new V-brace from BMW was put on, along with the new 16mm correct bolts as well. And the rear caliper bleed nipples were extremely corroded, so new BMW ones of those, which allowed us to carry out the brake fluid bleed perfectly. Moving down the car, the exhaust centre section nuts and bolts were in poor condition, so we've put copper BMW nuts on and stainless A2 bolts. The prop shaft coupling, rubber coupling was cracked, so a new genuine BMW prop coupling was supplied and fitted. The gearbox under tray and the fuel filter under tray were both missing when the car came in, so new genuine BMW plastics were fitted there, so you can see how bright they are with all their new fixings in place as well. The fuel filter, which is deep behind there, you might just be able to see it, it didn't have its stud out of the chassis. That looked like it had been snapped off and somebody had put a self-tapping screw in there, so we put a new chassis stud in there, painted it black, and then put the plastic nut on as well to secure that to an OEM fashion. Engine constant pressure valve was leaking oil, so we've replaced that valve up on the engine block and cleaned the oil leak. The exhaust downpipe fixings were the wrong way round, and we've put them the right way round, and we've also put the new BMW copper correct nuts as well, so it looks original as possible. Front xenon drop link system was broken, but also the potentiometer had blown apart with corrosion where those bolts had expanded the plastic housing. It had blown apart, so a new potentiometer with bolt and a new drop link system for that front xenon level system. The Ipact springs that were fitted at the front that we found were fitted upside down. They weren't doing any harm, but they have got a circle at the top and a non-circle at the bottom, so we fitted those the correct way. Front centre air guide was broken, which sits behind the bumper, this big plastic piece, where it had a little split on it, only a tiny bit, but the customer wanted quite rightly to make the car as original and as perfect as possible, so we supplied and fitted a new one of those as well. Rubber engine mounts were in poor condition and starting to break, so new engine mounts along with the correct BMW nuts top and bottom. Air conditioning drive belt was split. That's unfortunately now covered with this under tray, but a new aircon drive belt was fitted. and so was the power steering high pressure pipe, which always leaks on these cars, which goes from the pump to the rack behind this cover. So that was fitted with new drop links, with new power steering fluid and sealing rings. And also the steering tie rods were seized as well, so we weren't able to carry out the wheel alignment otherwise. So we took these off of the car, we sorted out the seized issue, coated them with copper slip in this instant, and then rebuilt them, put them back onto the vehicle, so alignment was able to be achieved perfectly. And then there's a few other things, just funny little picky things that we did that really we can't really put on the video because they're just too small. But the fuel filler neck rubber was split, the bonnet safety catch was replaced because it was too stiff, lambda probe wiring in the engine bay was too long, we fitted that correctly. Exhaust manifold heat shield was a little bit out of shape, which we sorted out. Pollen filter clip housing wasn't correctly seated. Antifreeze looked to be pink, so we sorted that out with a flush and then put blue correct genuine BMW antifreeze in there. A couple of light gaskets for the rear lights, a near side front strut brace bracket, some locking wheel bolt dust covers, and finally the front number plate plinth just needed to be straightened up and sorted. So quite a list of work on this one. It's been a really nice, enjoyable job. Very good bright phoenix yellow colour underneath, well protected from the environment, and nice new bushes. Oh, I forgot to mention the subframe bushes. One of the biggest and most important things with the new Diff carrier, obviously we've done subframe bushes as well. So genuine BMW rubber subframe bushes, which improves the feel and ride of this convertible. So that's all the items done, and now we can go and get the wheel alignment sorted. That's the end of the job complete now, and the car's just about to have an exit wash before it heads home. So we've done the wheel alignment, a full brake fluid bleed, and a 12-mile road test on this vehicle. And we've gone through the list of works we've just shown you on the video, which is the rear axle carrier panel repair and reinforcement process, with a whole host of other components like the bushes, the shock absorbers, and all those other items that we've just talked through. So if you've got an M3 that's needing the rear axle carrier panel work, or you just like to refresh the suspension or various things that are corroded underneath the car, give us a call at Redish Motorsport and we'll be able to help you out.